Shabbat Shalom Beitel. It's Saturday, the 21st of November. It is the Shabbat morning, or day, I should say, following the evening in which Debbie and I were not able to be present for the evening service, and we broadcast last night basically a service that was pre-recorded. It was filmed with recorded vignettes. I came out of that feeling like I owe you a sermon, and so I'm taking this time on Shabbat. I have a window of time where I can actually give myself to this, and I really wanted to give you something for this weekend. So there's something that's very much on my heart from the Parasha this week, which is called Toldot. Toldot is short for Ve'ele Toldot Yitzchak. These are the generations of Isaac. And the title of this mini-sermon is Turning the Page of History. Turning the Page of History. You're going to see my eyes wandering a little bit as I go to different places on my screen for resources here for the sermon, but I want to give this to you. It's heart to heart. It's the emes. This is really stuff from deep down to the bedrock of why I do what I do and why my commitments are what they are, why I am your rabbi, and why we are in this thing, this Cosa Nostra, this thing of ours, as the Italian language calls it, this movement, this tnuah in our generation, the Messianic Jewish or Two Testament movement. The title of this sermon is Turning the Page of History. Turning the Page of History. American President Theodore Roosevelt said toward the end of his life, when he was in correspondence with some men that had served with him in the all-volunteer regiment that went under Roosevelt's leadership to the Spanish-American War in Cuba. Roosevelt said of his small band of warriors, we turned the page of history. We turned the page of history. What did he mean? Well, in his and up to his era, I should say, the Americas, the Western Hemisphere, had been subject to tyranny by the better supplied, militarily mighty powers in Europe. And the European presences in America meant that Americans, North and South, were subjects of European powers. And the Europeans did to their subjects what they would. We were subject, I should say, we, the Western Hemisphere inhabitants, were subject to their whims. Everything from taxation without representation to the horrific exploits of deliberate creation of infections, of pandemics among the American first dwellers here. I don't use the term Native American because there really is, scientifically speaking, no such thing as a Native American. Everybody who is on the American continent either came over the ocean from Europe to America or Asia, or came from the other side of the world, came from Asia eastward over what was then the Bering Strait, thousands of years ago when it was solid. That is why first Americans tend to look Asian, is because that's where they come from. But there were no Native Americans. Nobody came from here. We all came to here. But that said, the people who arrived later than they from Europe actually brought smallpox-infested blankets with them in order to create pandemics among the first American dwellers here and decimate their populations. There is no limit to the amount of tyranny that was inflicted on people that have lived on this soil, led to the fanatic pursuit of freedom, such as the American Revolution expressed. The American Revolution was on this continent, an expression of our desire to throw off the shackles of tyranny. But in Theodore Roosevelt's era, Europe still held power over Cuba, and Spain was treating Cuba in a manner that was antithetical to the Western notion that the Western Hemisphere was a bastion of freedom. And so, Theodore assembled, inspired, or I should put this in a different order. Theodore Roosevelt inspired, assembled, trained, equipped, and led a regiment to the Spanish-American War. And their exploits there became famous. They were nicknamed the Rough Riders. The campaign that they led, that the campaign they carried out that was expressed at one point in the Battle of San Juan Hill, which was actually two hills that they had to attack multiple times, running up and down both hills, became the stuff of legends. Now, warfare is not to be romanticized. There is nothing wonderful about killing your fellow man. But what I want to point out about Roosevelt is that his commitment to freedom in this hemisphere, Roosevelt saw long before anyone else did what it would mean for America to express its commitment to freedom with action. Roosevelt didn't just talk, Roosevelt did. He was notorious as a talker. Theodore Roosevelt, it was joked by one of the people who knew him that whenever you're relating to President Roosevelt, you have to keep in mind that the president is about 6 years old. He was a bundle of energy and enthusiasm that could barely be a human body. And this president, before he ever became president, inspired this group of people to commit, in the words of the American their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to the task of creating the Western Hemisphere as a bastion of freedom without being in any way by tyranny. Now, the absence of tyranny is an idealistic dream, because you can have a country that is free, like America, and have tyrannies run by people with names like Rudolf Hearst or Andrew Carnegie or Rothschild. Well, no, Rothschild was European. I'm thinking J.P. Morgan. You can have tyrannies within a free country. That's why we have antitrust laws. The pursuit of freedom goes on. But what Roosevelt meant by turning the page of history was that he and his band, of Shakespeare from Henry V, we band of warriors, we band of brothers, we few, we happy few. This crew of men made up of a broad swath of people, all the way from, in terms of background, going from Harvard graduates and Yale graduates to rough cowboys and even criminals from the Western frontier that Roosevelt met while he was out there. They put it all on the line. They pushed all of their chips into the center and said, we are all in on the commitment to turn the page of history. I'm saying this to you on this Shabbat Toldot because if you read the Parasha this week, I have it open here in front of me. Ve'ele Toldot Yitzchak. These are the generations of Isaac, ben Avraham, son of Abraham. Avraham holid et Yitzchak. Abraham begat Isaac, Vayhi Yitzchak ben 40 shana, and Isaac was 40 years old. Bekachto et Rivka bat Betuel, when he took, or in his taking of Rebekah, the daughter of Betuel, Ha'arami, the Aramite, from Padan Aram, Achot Lavan, the sister of Lavan, Ha'arami, the Aramite, Lo Isha, for himself as a wife. Blah, 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 history lesson. Just, can we get to something interesting? Well, if you go ahead to the Haftarah that accompanies this Parasha, what you find is a very harsh rebuke from God to the priesthood in the generation of Malachi the prophet, some 400 years before the birth of Yeshua. We're going now like a couple thousand years in the future from this. And God is basically saying, look, you're in for a very harsh time if you do the job you were called to poorly. I'm going to be against you. I'm not going to fulfill your calling. I'm not going to be with you in the sense of causing you to prosper if you are bad priests. If you are bad priests, this rings very, very strongly to me, not only because my job is as a spiritual leader, but the word for priest is Cohen, and my family comes from this descent. So every time I hit this parasha and this haftarah, I get very, very convicted about making sure that I do what I do with a sincere heart and with full diligence, and do my best to not to be able to be pried away from the truth, because what these scriptures say is that a priest, a Kohen, his mouth should be a source of truth. That's when you come to the Kohen, get judgment from the Kohen is what you should be able to expect. It's not just a luxury, it's something that you should expect, is to get a good, sound scriptural judgment when you approach the Kohen, your spiritual leader. Or in the words of Hebrews 13:17, the leaders set over you who are accountable to God on your behalf. We are accountable to God for what it is that you do, how you do spiritually, up to the extent where your choice is not to follow what we offer. It doesn't go beyond that. We can lead a horse to water, so to speak, but we can't make them drink. But it is up to us to provide the clear, pure water to drink, at least. After that, what a horse does is between the horse and God, so to speak. Theodore Roosevelt, in saying this, we turned the page of history. He had a sense not just that there was stuff to do, but there was important to do. And I've been trying to convey this to everybody I have ever influenced, from my students when I was teaching children below the age of 10 years old, all the way up until now in my mid-60s when I'm teaching adults, basically. Well, entirely adults at this point. The children in our synagogue are influenced by what I do through how I influence their parents and our personal connection. But beyond that, my time now is spent teaching and addressing adults. But the influence that I seek to cast is the same. To be a vision caster. What I'm trying to get across to people, and I saw a video of myself and my former music partner, John Rose, giving a concert in Los Angeles back in 1993, and my message was the same. When the break in our concert came before the last song, I was playing the piano, and as I'm playing, I was speaking to the crowd and telling anyone there, anyone who's just been sort of flying by the movement of Two Testament Judaism. Your blood is Jewish, or you have a calling of some kind to it, and you're just sort of passing by every so often, and you're, sort of seeing, sort of hearing. You're sort of here, and you're sort of not. We see you at the conferences. We see you where there's stuff for you to enjoy and to get, but you haven't put your shoulder to the plow. You haven't answered the call. You haven't decided that this is where you are going to help to turn the page of history, so to speak. I want to plead with you, as I did. All the way back in 1993, I was pleading with these people I was speaking to realize, as we celebrated the holiday of Sigd this past week, the Ethiopian community rejoices in the giving of the Torah and remembers Yom Kippur and prostrates. These God to prostrate before God. Zig comes from that word in Hebrew and Aramaic. And to prostrate before God and to acknowledge him as Lord. To be Lord of this part of the world. That means to surrender our personal priorities, to surrender the things that were formerly exalted. As I taught from the scriptures from Psalms this week to Torah Tefillah, my teaching on Wednesday night was about Im Eshkachai Yerushalayim, if I forget you, O Jerusalem, if I do not exalt you above my chief high. Well, it was Sigd, the Ethiopian Jewish community scattered from Israel all the way down into mid-Africa for the last 500 to 600 years, and probably for the thousands before them. Because that community was born out of the first dispersion from Israel by Babylon 587 years before Yeshua was born. That community greeted each other at the end of this season with the same words that we Jews in the Western diaspora say after Pesach. Bashana haba'a b'Yerushalayim. Next year in Jerusalem. Now, there are people who hear their entire lives, and all they are is a way to end the Seder. They sing, Lashana haba'a b'Yerushalayim, Lashana haba'a b'Yerushalayim. Hey! It's lovely, but not if it has no meaning. Jerusalem is a symbol of the big picture for the Jewish people. Jerusalem is a reminder. We say to each other, we didn't come from this soil. Where we're scattered, we're scattered. There are promises starting from Deuteronomy chapter 30 all the way into the New Testament that we will be regathered. And we all are living. Here comes the joiner for the theme of the sermon. We're living in the season of history where that regathering has already begun. In the words of Yeshua the Messiah, many kings and prophets have longed to see what you and I have seen, and we haven't. They haven't seen it, but we have. Many, as I was reminded the first time I ever went to Jerusalem and stood in that model of the ancient city and the Holy Land Hotel, the guide said, you all should say a prayer before we start looking at this model, because the number of ancestors who wished with all their hearts that they would ever get to this city and never got here is beyond counting. The fact that you are standing in Jerusalem, Amdot hayu ragleinu b'Yerushalayim, our feet are standing inside your walls, inside your gates, O Jerusalem, as the psalmist put it. We've turned. We are turning the page of history. That is my hope. You see behind me on the shelf, I put up, you can see going from over here, my 500-some page apologetic for Messianic Judaism, the collection of my scores from some 40 years in Messianic Jewish ministry, the first solo album I published, my workbook on Israel, Arabs, and the Middle East that I am told has been read by Benjamin Netanyahu, that made its way to him through one of the high donors in the Likud who is a Two Testament Jew, the anthology of my 40 years of composition and performance in Messianic music. Why are these up here? Well, I'm selling stuff. No. They're up here for this sermon because what I believe with what I do as a spiritual leader, as a speaker, a teacher, a shaliach, a musician, I am trying to help turn the page of history. I'm trying to cause the era where our people are separated from Mashiach ben Yosef Shenehorog, Messiah, son of Joseph, who will be slain, the figure that the Talmudic sages know had to come and offer himself and his sinless life up in our place to atone for us, to make final atonement before us and God, and cause our relationship to be remended. I'm trying to help turn the page of history where that false separation, that needless separation is erased. And in the words of Paul, Rav Shaul, the Shaliach in the New Testament, pleading, be reconciled to God. How can you ignore this great gift? This gift that God has put into human history with such clear affirmation through the prophetic scriptures that the Messiah would come to us. The family of David, be born in Bethlehem, be born in Israel during the time between the rebuilding of the Second Temple and its destruction in 70 CE. The markers are laid out so clearly for you and for me. Since I have been 17 years old, this message has had its hand on my heart, and since I was 23, I have been fully into it as a vocation, not just as a faith. I'm telling you, I want to be able to look in your eyes, Bethel, the people that I have led, the people part of the flock to whom I have been responsible before God to lead. I want to be able to look into your eyes when my time comes to leave this world and say, we turned the page of history. Turned the page of history. That is not in the thinking. As Yeshua of Nazareth half-brother Yaakov, or James, said, as he's called James, and his name is Jacob actually, but he wrote for us. He said, you want to talk about faith? He said, you show me your ideas, I'll show you my deeds. I'll show you the trail behind me of what I have done. And that's not just these books or this music, but it's the countless thousands of miles traveled, the countless podia upon which I have stood in synagogues and churches and public events. Why have I done it? Why am I still doing it? Why, at age 65, does my energy seem unabated? It is because, as I say at the start of every service in our synagogue, Ve'ele hem chayei ha'olam. This is eternal life we're talking about. L'da'atotcha, to know you. Ha'elohim levadecha, the one true God. Ve'et Yeshua Mashiach asher shalachta, and Yeshua the Messiah, whom you have sent. Sent for me, sent for you. sent to turn us from sinners headed for eternity away from God to sinners saved by grace. Sinners who, by the sheer grace of God, have been rescued as we've been falling into the fire, cupped out of the fire by his own, well, in the words of the Torah, underneath were the everlasting arms that caught us as we were falling. We were falling to the flames, and he caught us, and he raised us up, and he planted our feet upon a rock, that rock that is the Messiah Yeshua, that sure, tzur shuatenu, the rock of salvation. We turned the page of history. God has already turned the page. The pages are turning forward in the book. The question is, what part of the book are you playing a role in? I just want to encourage you. I don't care if you're 15 or 55 or 102. There is a role for you. You're still in this world. There are still, in the words of Rav Shaul, there are still good works prepared beforehand by God for you to do, that you should walk in them. It is time to dust ourselves off and to return to the spirit of that all-volunteer regiment that committed itself to turn the page. All volunteers. They were not draftees. They volunteered to go because the page of history had to be turned. How important is it to you that our people come to know the Messiah, who is the only source of atonement that God has placed into the world for us at this time? How important is that to you? I want to remind you, I'm told at times my approach to faith can be at times overly militaristic, but I want to tell you this before I close, is that back in the 1980s I wrote an all a cappella, an all vocal piece called Vahavta. It is a soprano, alto, tenor, bass, fuguesque, a rhapsody on what Yeshua of Nazareth called the greatest commandment in the Torah, to love the Lord our God with all our heart, all our soul, and all our minds. Now, the reason I wrote this sounds very clinical, very cold and calculating, but the piece that came out of it, if you listen to it, the passion in it is when it was, there was somebody who came up afterwards and said, man, that was industrial strength music. So what arose from it sounds like a clinical decision was actually planted with passion. And here's what it came down to. I had, as a musician, I had been at this point performing as a musician. It was in the mid to late 1980s. I had been performing since the late 1970s. And I had seen in Judaism a lot of composition done where scriptural texts were written into classical format pieces. And it was very common. There were a lot of these pieces of music around. And I decided, you know what? It's not right that without Messiah be the exclusive holders of this turf. This San Juan Hill, so to speak, we have to run up it and attack it. We have to take that turf for the faith in Messiah, for Judaism with Messiah in it. And so I decided to write this piece, an a cappella piece. And I have long been, since I was a teenager, I've been in love with the fugue. Ever since the person who was then Walter Carlos published Switched on Bach, the synthesizer, the first synthesizer virtuoso album of it came out in 1968, the year of my bar mitzvah, a fitting timing. I've been in love with fugues ever since I heard them performed by Walter Carlos on the Moog synthesizer, and so I very quickly went to the idea of a vocal fugue. But that piece was specifically to run up that hill and take that turf at the top of the hill for Two Testament faith, Two Testament Judaism. It can be that deliberate. Your decision making about what you choose to do with your life, your gifts, your focus, it can all be that deliberate. Our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor, what the Vahavta calls all our minds, all our hearts, and all our me'od. What is me'od? Our very, all of our very. It means what's above the minimum, that which is above the minimum. So I call you to it. I call everyone who hears this to it. There's there are things you can do. There are good works prepared before, as the book of Philippians says, that you can walk in them. It might be to pray for us. It might be to support us financially. It might be to join a synagogue, whether physically or virtually, to share very, very deliberately, to share the presence of our services on the air with people. Send the link to people that you know and say, I'd really appreciate it. I consider it a personal favor if you would dial into this service on Facebook Live or on YouTube some Friday evening, or go to it afterwards, because once it's broadcast forever, go and listen to a few of these and tell me what you think. Because in my view, everything of value is wrapped up in this. Everything. And join in with those whom God has called to turn the page of history. To turn the page of history. Oh, I want to say this to you when we're over. I want to look in your eyes, those of you who if my life works out such that when my time comes to leave, I have some preparatory window before it. Although, please God, I hope I'll still be flat like this 30 years from now when I'm 95. I hope I still look a little bit like this, and I hope that I can still deliver like this, both personally and musically. But I want to be able to look in your eyes and say we turned the page of history, or at least we did the part that God wanted us to do. We played the role God wanted us to play. So I wish you a Shabbat Shalom, a Shabbat filled not just with Shalom, the absence of conflict, but from the root Shalem, completion. That the circuit would close. That you would know that you know that you know what you are called to do, with whom you're called to do, where you're called to do, for whom you are called to do. Me and mine, as Joshua said, our house will serve the Lord, and we will do it focused upon our Jewish people, not because Jewish people are better or worse than anybody else, but because this is the focus that God has given us, to which we are to give our lives and our fortunes and our sacred honor, our heart, our soul, and our me'od. May the God of peace be with you, the God of shalom, the God of peace and of completeness, be with every one of you this Shabbat. The God not just of the absence of conflict, but of completeness. May he be with all of you on this Shabbat, and bring you that sense of fullness of focus and understanding and context as we all go forward together. I look forward to seeing you next week. Shabbat Shalom.